Well, Professor Furedi, thanks for taking the time to do this interview. I was looking forward to it a lot. I read a lot of your books, not all of them, because the list is quite impressive. And I'm looking forward to talk to you about, I think, a challenging topic. That's the educational system. And the way that we organize education, and also maybe the way that we look at education from a sociological perspective. I've prepared some questions for you. Maybe just to kick off, my first question would be, how do you see the essence of education? So what is the function of education based on your experience and expertise in our society?
Well, I think the first goal of education is to provide young people with an environment and with an outlook that allows them to understand and appreciate the intellectual and moral legacies of human development. So there is a transmission element where we're transmitting all the time the insights of the past. And at the same time, while we're doing that, what we're doing is we're allowing young people to transcend their immediate experience. So they don't just simply see things from the point of view of their own home, their own community, but are able to have a larger view of the world. In that sense, through the acquisition of disciplinary knowledge, they're able to acquire a wider view of the world. And then finally, I think what's very important about education, what education should do, is to prepare young people for freedom and for intellectual independence, so that they too can then make their own way in the world, and in the end play a role in educating and socializing and guiding the future generations. Yeah.
That's very clear, the way that you describe it. The first point you mentioned also, sharing the knowledge from history to the current generation. Why is that important?
Well, I think it's particularly important now because we live in a very presentist moment where we seem to live in the present, where a lot of people are telling us that we need to be detached from the past. The past is all bad. We should forget about it. They have archaic ways of looking at things. At the same time, we're too fearful and anxious to have a future-oriented imagination. And we seem to be very much sort of rooted in the present. And one of the things that I noticed, even amongst university students, is that they, like the adults, suffer from a very powerful sense of historical amnesia. And we have no sense of what it was like in the past. We are not able to compare what is specific to our own circumstances. There's a very powerful impulse to almost kind of rewrite the past and judge the past by our own standards. And we cannot understand that if you look back upon the last couple of thousand of years, there were some very positive developments there, as well as human beings making a lot of mistakes. And we have to understand where we come from in order to be able to understand who we are in the here and now.
So that's So we have a tendency to change the history or the way that we look at history nowadays to make it a little bit more the way that we like it.
Yes, I mean, there's always been an attempt to rewrite history. That happens in all cultures, especially in the modern era. I think what has changed is that in more recent times, there's been a tendency to kind of displace the objective of dealing with the problems of today by fixing the problems of the past. So we want to, sort of get rid of old statues because these statues are statues of bad people. We want to continually sort of argue that, look at these people in the 19th century, how horrible they were. They weren't as enlightened as we are. And we almost kind of forget the fact that that this is a different circumstance, different possibilities. Sometimes when I see young people in universities in the Anglo-American world, they when they try to topple a statue over, it's almost as if they think these statues are living now,
Yeah.
as if they're living human beings, rather than simply representations of a particular era that has gone, beforehand. So what you have as a result of that is an extremely ahistorical sense of temporality, and not really see the fact that there's something very specific and unique about our own circumstances, which we have to understand in their own terms, just as we have to understand the unique circumstances within which people lived in different historical era.
Yeah. You mentioned the topic of fear, and you wrote a book about fear. You studied it extensively. What way do you relate the fear and our tendency to change history and to sort of make ourselves better by changing history?
Well, it relates to the topic of education in one very important respect, which is that in the course of educating young people, we're kind of socializing them, and we're trying to historically socialize them into the values and to the norms that we think society needs to live by. And what I argue in my book is that one of the things that we've become very bad at is basically transmitting values, particularly moral values, to young people. We find it very difficult to let them understand what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad. And indeed, in a lot of schools and universities, we tend to fall back upon a very kind of silly saying, which is we tell them, oh, there's no such thing as right and wrong. So somehow there isn't such a thing as a right or wrong. We kind of give up on the need to morally sort of educate them, not moralistically, but morally. And I think as a result of that, what we've tended to do is we've relied, on other means for educating or in socializing young people. So instead of using a kind of a values or a related form of socialization, we rely on psychological techniques. And certainly in the Anglo-American world, what we do with children is we try to flatter them, raise their self-esteem. There's an expression we use in English, which is validation. We have to validate the children all the time.
Yeah.
We have to emotionally support them all the time. And we think that by giving them loads and loads of smiley faces, and we make them feel good and not criticize them, that they're going to become able to deal with the world. But instead what we do is actually do not get them to understand that there are important moral virtues that allows them to deal with fear. Things like courage, for example, prudence, basic fundamental sort of virtues are quite important in order to strengthen young people's view of the world so that they can deal with uncertainty, they can deal with their anxieties, understand that being anxious and upset and being distressed are not a psychological problem, but that's the normal existential problems that all of us human beings face in the course of making our way in the world. And instead of sort of medicalizing that in the way that education does at the moment, we need to provide people with the philosophical, the historical, the intellectual sort of resources to deal with them.
Yeah. It could maybe, I was thinking about the philosophical period of the Enlightenment, in which we also let go of some of the Greek values or the ancient values and said, well, nowadays there is no truth, there's only perspective. Sort of the idea of sharing what you think instead of connecting to sort of a higher universal moral code isn't very normal anymore.
I think you're right, but I don't sort of attribute that to the Enlightenment. I think the Enlightenment has a very robust universalistic outlook. If you read Immanuel Kant, it's all about sort of cultivating this kind of universalistic imagination. And I think although there's a reaction against the ancients, which already begins earlier on, even before the Enlightenment, nevertheless, within Enlightenment thinking, there is an attempt to appropriate what is seen as the best of the contribution of the Greeks and of the Romans, And I think that if you look at the Enlightenment, there isn't this kind of impulse towards saying there's no such thing as right and wrong. I think what there is, sort of is a kind of open-mindedness, which I fully share, where you understand that part of our jobs as human beings is to be able to yield to new experience. But in order to yield to new experience, you don't just give up everything that has gone on beforehand. You find a way of using the moral, intellectual legacies of the past to give you the capacity to deal with uncertainty in the modern era. And I think that's what the Enlightenment was about. Unfortunately, the promise of the Enlightenment and the intellectual legacy of the environment is today compromised by the fact that both sides of the ideological spectrum are anti-Enlightenment, and fundamentally both, sort of old school conservatives are uncomfortable with Enlightenment and its idea of autonomy, but also what's called left wing today. Sort of, I don't really know what that means anymore, but the kind of what's called liberal, again, I don't know what that means anymore. They too are very uncomfortable with the kind of rigorous, future-oriented vision of Enlightenment thinking.
And that's very interesting. That brings me to a question of one of the listeners that was shared via Twitter to me, to ask to you. When you talk about, for instance, effective or strong learning process or educational processes, and you, in Holland at least, you talk, for instance, about classroom education and not individually based learning. So you would say that, for instance, paying attention to instruction, to effective group instruction. A lot of the time when you do that, the criticism you get is that you are conservative. And it's very fastly being made politics instead of talking about education. So a lot of the problems we have in Holland, when you talk about education, is very fastly becoming a political discussion. And the question would be to you, I don't know if you can answer it one-on-one, but why is that the case? Why do we make these kinds of conversation, which is about good education, so fast a political discussion?
Well, I think that you ask a very kind of difficult question, which is the subject of my next book, which is got to do with the fact that it is in education that all the important conflicts of today, which are principally cultural conflicts, which then become politicized, begin. And it's in the realm of socialization that the first important sort of debates and arguments come to the fore. And I think the reason for that has got to do with what I see as a very big problem, which is that contemporary pedagogy in particular has become so enamored with technique and psychologization that it forgets one important point, which everybody recognized until recently, not just conservatives, but left-wing Marxists. I mean, everybody who had a brain cell understood that education had an inherently conserving function, which didn't mean to say that it was necessarily conservative, but there was an element of conservation that's contained in education, because you're conserving, what you believe to be the most important contributions of human knowledge and human science. And that's what you're partially doing. And it's interesting that view of the world wasn't just simply the monopoly of conservative educators, but also very radical ones, people like Gramsci, Marx, and Lenin. Marx, for example, was an advocate of classical education, believed it was really, really important. There's a regular example in Italy during the time of Mussolini, when Mussolini began to adopt the kind of technical education that we got in Holland and England today, and skills-based education. And there's an instance where Gramsci, who was in prison at the time, wrote to his son, advising him not to go down the road of skills-based education, but he said it was very important to understand and appreciate the classics, to be able to learn Latin, and the importance of learning Greek, and because he understood that these were precious gains of humanity that you couldn't just throw away. So it's only in more recent times that you have this, sort of denunciation of education, sort of what I call real education as conservative, and where you got this kind of polarization that has begun to kick in. And that's to do with the fact that, unfortunately, teachers' training and pedagogy has become detached so much from a commitment to disciplinary-based, knowledge-based kind of education.
Yeah.
And I think it's very unfortunate that we've kind of adopted this very narrow sort of technical outlook, skills-focused outlook on education.
That's very interesting. It's you could say, even no matter what politics you have. I interviewed half a year ago a philosopher in Leiden who said, well, I have great difficulty in working with my students because they cannot read longer texts. They have difficulty in reading text above 5 pages, or they do not know the origin of a specific word. So no matter what kind of politics you have, that's a real challenge for a teacher to work with. And you cannot understand, Immanuel Kant or other philosophers if you study philosophy. So it's a real challenge. Yeah,
it is. But I think we need to be very careful, because I think there is a kind of a consensus that has emerged in the last 15 years that suggests that young people are not able to pay attention, that young people cannot read long texts, that young people cannot listen to a teacher for longer than 15 minutes or 20 minutes. And these ideas first began in schools, but now they've migrated into higher education, where very similar arguments are now being used. And I've done a lot of work. In fact, in my work on reading, I wrote a book called The Power of Reading that discusses these things. And I make the point that, in a sense, the very idea of inattention, of not being able to pay attention, is really a relatively new development. The word inattention was only invented in the 18th century. It didn't really exist beforehand. And I think it's something that we tend to naturalize as being a given state. But actually, what I understand to be the problem is that a lot of young people are almost told that you cannot really be expected to read a book. Very often in schools, we don't even try to get them to read a book. We just give them these worksheets, and therefore, surprise, surprise, reading books becomes an alien experience. We tell young people, it's very difficult to listen to a boring teacher for half an hour, 45 minutes. And it's almost like we kind of de-educate children by lowering their expectations of what's expected of them. So the problem lies not with children somehow becoming idiots because they watch too much screens or they play around with digital toys. The problem lies with the education system that expects young people not to be able to do these things.
Well, that's very clear. You could also say the point you make before this is in Holland we got an increase in dyslexia statements. So I think 30% in the middle school children get dyslexia statements. It's very difficult when you get a statement like that, or on the other side of the spectrum, if you are highly intelligent, you also sometimes get picked out of the school into a separate class. And you could say, well, all the other children look at these children and immediately know, okay, I do not have it. I'm not in the higher group. So on both ends, you get very big challenges, and that does something with children. But it's your analysis based on not on the children itself, but on the school system. So that's very clear, yeah.
And the culture that supports.
And the culture, yeah.
You can look at a dyslexia statement in two ways. You can say it's a statement that reflects a physical, biological, or a psychological reality, and therefore it merely reflects that. Or you can see a dyslexia statement as a cultural statement, which is kind of which communicates a certain set of expectations of what a child can or cannot do. And I think that what has happened is that we've kind of medicalized childhood to the point at which you see a steady increase in these special needs kind of syndromes, And it kind of increases year by year to the point at which anybody will understand that it's epidemiologically impossible that in some school systems you have half the children who are dyslexic. It just simply is unlikely, that kind of coincidence could occur. But rather what you have is a situation where we explain young people's difficulties or teachers' failures to teach reading properly as a result of some kind of psychological or physical or medical kind of conditions. And that's to do with the culture of the world that we're living in, rather than with the fact that children somehow have got these difficulties. And of course, once you tell kids that their reading problems are due to dyslexia, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and they will live the life sort of accordingly.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely very true. On the other side of the spectrum, last week I interviewed a teacher of a high school who every year started with learning a poem by heart of 2 pages. And so he has 25 children in the class, and he teaches English. And in the beginning he said, well, we're going to learn this poem in 3 to 4 weeks. And in the beginning the children are like, whoa, we'll never, we never did this, it's difficult. How should we accomplish it? But in 3 weeks they know it by heart. And it gives an enormous way of, enormous feeling of power, and also of being proud of yourself and of the group. And he uses it very explicitly in his teachings. So, you could say that's absolutely true.
I got a very good story about that, personal story, which is I'm a very old father. So I remember not that long ago, there was a poetry competition in my son's primary school. And I had no idea what a poetry competition was. And I sat down with him and I said, look, why don't you memorize this poem that I think is really, really good, called The Charge of the Light Brigade. It's kind of quite exciting, kind of voice kind of poem, but it's fairly long. And I remember, so we arrive at the competition, and all the children in the competition have learned like a 2-paragraph poem about animals, really silly, childish kind of poems. And, every child gets a standing ovation. So my son gives this poem, which goes on for much, much longer because it's a fairly long poem. And I felt, and I looked around, and then the woman who was running the competition turns to the headmistress of the school, and she's completely upset about the fact that my son has done this. And she says, to my son, well, do you understand this long poem? The implication being that, he is somehow been programmed by, an idiot to do this. And so she asked a question. My son is the only person to be asked a question about what the poem means. He gives a good answer. And the woman looks even more upset. So she turns to the headmistress and says, what should I do? What should I do? And the headmistress gets up and says, your son Jacob got, won the poem competition. But I thought the exchange between the two women was really very interesting, because in this woman's eye, who's this professional convener of poetry competitions, what has happened there was a cultural crime. It was wrong to ask, sort of a 6 or 7-year-old boy to memorize a long poem. It was just some complete out of the realm of possibility, rather than realizing that if he could do it, all the other children could have done it at that point.
Yeah, that's a fantastic example. You see, so it also, children can do a lot more than we think, maybe. In that way, we should set high standards. There's also discussion in Holland. For instance, the calculus results in Holland, that the children that are able to do math in a proper way is declining years on years. But now it's getting to a level that people are increasingly upset about it. And what's very interesting is that when you talk to school teachers or headmasters, most of the time they say we should set higher standards, not lower standards. We should make it more simple, not be sort of a victim of the books that we have to buy, but give good basic math and set higher standards, because they are quite able to do it. That's not the problem.
Yeah, well, you're lucky in Holland, because in England, a lot of teachers have given up on that altogether.
Really? Okay.
And unfortunately, many of them find all kinds of reasons where it's not necessary to learn quadratic equations or to learn calculus. And instead of trying to foster a climate of curiosity about mathematics, there's a kind of banal teaching style where you basically expect very little.
Yeah.
And continually demanding that the curriculum should be changed downwards.
Yeah. Yeah, that's okay. Well, we could maybe to explore a different topic with you, Professor Furedi, is about citizenship. What is striking to me is that in Holland there is increasingly attention to civil citizenship. It's already put in the law that schools should do something with civic entrepreneurs and civic citizenship. Sorry. So the question would be: when are you a good person? Do you enable democratic values, etc., etc., etc.? Inclusion is an important topic, but also in schools, sustainability, obviously with the climate crisis happening now, is a very hot topic. But what kind of consequences do you see when countries like Holland adapt these kinds of values and impose them in the curriculum?
Well, I worry about them because, you see, I'm a big believer in citizenship. But that is something that should come about through the course of everyday life. We become good citizens by following the example of our parents, members of our community. We develop good democratic values through living democratically. It's not something that you learn in school. It's something that you live in your community. And if in a community, citizenship and the responsibilities and duties of citizens are not taken seriously, you cannot really solve that problem in schools. And I think what has happened in Western societies is that what's called citizenship education is actually a kind of social engineering, where you try to influence young people with the latest fashionable values. And every time there's a problem in society, we are worried about the fact that kids are too fat, or we're worried about the fact that there is a problem in the environment, or we're worried about the fact that somehow a lot of kids don't know how to deal with financial problems or financial issues. We kind of deal with it in the curriculum, and citizenship education tends to be a series of latest fashions, whereby we often get kids to think along the lines that politicians want them to think. And what's even worse, and this is what I worry about, is very often citizenship classes aim to teach children values that detach them from those of their parents, where they almost teach them, look, your parents, they don't understand climate change or recycling. You have to teach your parents rather than they teach you. You have to teach them how to behave in an environmentally responsible way. In the United Kingdom, we teach children about transgender related, even in primary schools, how transgender culture is really very important and very progressive. And your job as a child is to tell your parents that this is a really good and a very kind of positive development. So what you have is what I call a process of socialization in reverse, where through citizenship education, you're not only socially engineering and manipulating children, but you're getting children to somehow influence the behavior of their parents.
I haven't followed it in that way. So you learn children sustainability is good. Your parents are not doing a good job, or you shouldn't drink. Maybe your parents drink, or you should exercise. Your parents are not exercising, etc., etc.
That's right. I mean, locally where I live, one of the schools recently was telling children about the dangers of driving cars. It's bad for the environment, about the dangers of traffic, and was inciting the kids to tell their parents not to drive the car. Certainly, not to kind of do too much traveling in airplanes and everything else. So the kids go home And, these are like 6, 7, 8-year-old kids. And they're lecturing mom and dad about the fact that, they should adopt a different way of moving around. Now, it may well be the case that a lot of English adults could benefit from cycling around and be very, very good for their health. But I just think there's something wrong when young people are told that they're morally superior to their parents because they understand far better than the mom and dad about what is good for society.
Yeah, that's a dangerous slope when you're getting there. And also the point is that it opens the door to politics in education again. So for now it's sustainability, but maybe in 5 years there could be a party who gets a lot of votes in Holland who says, well, we're against immigration. We don't like that. Or we want, like we have the PVV, the Partij voor de Vrijheid, shut down the borders, get out of the EU. And maybe when they get some saying in Holland, they could say, no, well, that should be in the program. It's a far away perspective, but it could be the case.
Yeah, I mean, it's already happening. I think that the political values that are transmitted to through social engineering are as bad as it could get. I mean, one of the things that I worry about is that one of the main values that education puts forward is the value of non-judgmentalism. You tell children not to judge, that judging is a bad thing, and that non-judgmentalism is meant to be, the same thing as being tolerant. But of course, if you understand what tolerance means judging people. And it's about judging people who you think are wrong, but because you believe in tolerance, you still allow them to express their views.
Yeah,
that's what tolerance really means. So, in a sense, paradoxically, contemporary education miseducates young people about the value of tolerance, which is why so many young people, when they go to universities, so readily become intolerant, because they kind of grew up on this kind of miseducation.
Yeah, that's interesting. So we teach them not to have an opinion, not to have a moral standard, not to think
they can
about
have an opinion, but they cannot, believe that it's better than somebody else's.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, that's what you see in Holland, also in the education for grown-ups, how to say, vocational training, but also training programs for MBAs. It's all about inclusion. So also for managers and leaders, it's not about having a perspective, but about connecting perspectives. So it's sort of the social constructivistic way to looking at development. So it's really setting foot. You should listen to explore, connect the interests, and then you can get ahead in life.
Yeah, I mean it's all about personal skills. It's all about
skills. Yeah.
Sort of things that you don't need to get an MBA for, to be really honest.
No, the skills that you can pick up maybe. That's true. Yeah. Another question on another topic. What I see, what is happening in Holland is a lot of focus on innovation. Education should be different. We should, break it, build it up again, but especially attention to topics like reflection, 21st century skills, cooperation, listening, brain-based learning is also very hip and happening last year. There are even in Holland, you have brain-based schools. I wrote an article about it. I still do not know exactly what it is, but you have them. But also digital transformation. You shouldn't read in a book. My children learn from an iPad. Sometimes it works, but often also it has challenges. But what I find interesting is there is very little evidence that it works. So, why?
Well, it's got to do with the fact that one of the philosophical or political underpinnings of current pedagogy is that we live in a rapidly changing world. And because the world changes all the time, what worked in the past will not work now. And what made sense in the past becomes irrelevant today. So that's one way of rejecting the past, but its pedagogic reflection is that pedagogy has become a prisoner of fads, of not just technical fads, but also other kind of fads. So one morning we discovered that it's really important that teenagers are allowed to sleep later in the mornings, and school should begin at 10 o'clock or 10:30 because their attention is much better at that point. So all of a sudden that becomes the latest fad. But we also have this kind of almost like a very blind desire and hope that the problems of the classroom are going to be solved by some technological quick fix, that there's some kind of magic bullet out there that's going to solve the problems. And if you look at the way, for example, in which pedagogy about reading has changed, the way in which, one day we discover whiteboards and that's going to change the world, how digital sort of learning is celebrated. You got this stupid idea of blended learning as becoming the main way forward. What we see is the continuation of a process that has a very, very long history. And I think what's really sad about it is that that no sooner is this new fad going to be introduced before it's realized that it makes no difference whatsoever.
No.
And then you don't say, well, instead of looking for a fad, let's see whether we can teach people better by understanding our discipline a little bit more, by taking ideas a little bit more seriously. You don't do that. You go on to the next kind of fad, and you have meditation and reflection. Anything is possible as long as you don't really get to the content of your subject matter.
Exactly.
You don't really teach what is integral to the discipline that you're trying to communicate to children.
That's the tragic consequences. We had that same discussion, more or less same discussion about gym and sports. So especially at base level teaching, so from 0 to 12 years old, children move less. There are fewer gym teachers, and also the time for gym is decreasing. The government has tried to change that with no success. But what you see now is that a lot of people talk about the idea that, for instance, for calculus, you should also move. So that movement and physical movement is important. And so they make all sorts of challenges in the school that children can move around and do games, and then they will learn better. But the silly thing is, if you want to memorize the tables from 1 to 10, what it needs is repeatedly attention. So a good instruction, attention every day, preferably, and not at one day only and then forget it for a couple of weeks. So you get sort of a management innovation doom loop, constantly thinking up new things. Now it's gym, then it will be reflection, then it's brain-based learning. And what you say is that the attention to the essence of the course or the discipline gets less or erodes in a way.
I mean this is unfortunately the way things work at the moment. And you have I'm just amazed at the rapidity with which all these new things are being brought in. And you have these ideas about different styles of learning. And some kids are good at reading, other kids are good at colors, other kids are good at sounds. And instead of trying to understand that yes, we all have our own one-sided way of approaching the world, but nevertheless we still need to have a common educational curriculum that everybody buys into. And instead of trying to find ways of inspiring kids' intellectual curiosity, we take that idealism and natural curiosity of children and we channel them in the wrong directions where they're going to have no positive consequences in terms of their intellectual development.
That brings me to the next question, and it's about the topic of authority. What's very interesting in the Netherlands is that one of the best sold books on education is the title in Dutch is Orde houden, so keeping authority in class. written by a teacher who had difficulties a math teacher who had difficulties in managing his class, and wrote a book about it, how to do it. What's very interesting is that the book is not being used at a lot of educational schools for being a teacher. So that's interesting. But my question is, in the Netherlands, many teachers and schools experience problems with exercising authority to children. So they have difficulties in organizing structure, discipline, listening more than 3 minutes, etc., etc. Also in the Netherlands, the classes are very noisy. So there's, I think, a USCD study that Holland has one of the most noisiest classes. Can you explain from a sociological perspective why this is, maybe?
Well, I think that in pedagogy, in teachers' training, and more generally in culture, authority often has some very negative associations. And we don't encourage people to behave authoritatively. And we don't encourage teachers to understand their role as kind of authoritative figures within the classroom. I think that's been missing for a very long time from teachers' training. And certainly I know that most teachers that I know not only are not able to exercise authority, they actually don't think it's a really good thing. So what teachers try to do is to compensate for the absence of authority by trying to be the students' friends, or by trying to be really cool, or by trying to make a lot of jokes, or by somehow, kind of taking shortcuts around the curriculum, find all kinds of different ways. But of course, none of these work. And it seems to me that though there are teachers who understand this problem and they manage to gain authority. I mean, there's always, when you talk to, just last week I was talking to a group of sort of 16-year-old students in a local grammar school, and they were telling me about this one teacher that they all like. And it's interesting, he's the one teacher that everybody seems to like in the school. And, and if you look at this teacher, he's not a clown. He doesn't make a lot of jokes. He's got a sense of humor, but what he is he takes his discipline, his kind of subject matter very, very seriously. He's very enthusiastic about it. He almost infects his students with his enthusiasm. And he takes a lot of time and a lot of trouble at explaining things. He takes a lot of time and a lot of trouble at drawing students out, getting them to sort of explain the problems that they have in relation to the subject. And what he's managed to do is to actually create a very good kind of dialogue, kind of a banter even, sometimes even using a bit of humor with his classroom, so everybody feels that they are part of this kind of common experience of which he is the authority figure. Now, what's important here is that authority is not something that God gives you. It's not something that's handed on from high. Just because you're a teacher doesn't mean to say you're authoritative, because you can be a teacher and be an idiot, as we all know, unfortunately, now and again. But what it does mean is, and how it comes about, is you earn the authority. And the way you earn the authority as a teacher is mainly by being really on top of your subject, by being able to communicate complex ideas simply, not simplistically, but simply, being able to explain the difficult question in such a way that it can be expressed in a language that students understand, whilst challenging them, while stretching them. So it's the accomplishment of living authority that makes you an authority. It's not something you're going to get in the first year of teaching. It takes a bit of time to get to that point, but it is the obligation, and it's one of the, to me, the most interesting challenge of teaching is how you sort of become, move from being just an ordinary guy who's just got a few ideas and goes into the classroom to one who becomes a genuine authority figure.
Yeah, that's fascinating. What is also interesting, what you mentioned about that we have sort of an implicit idea about authority, that it is a one-way street, and that it has discipline. Everybody should be quiet. and there's always a test, but the opposite is the case. There is interaction, there is dialogue, but the teacher is responsible for the group and stands above or higher than the topic and is able to break it down in steps. Yeah,
exactly. And what's often overlooked is that authority is a relationship. It's the exercise of authority is not about lecturing and yelling at people or just kind of telling them what to do. Genuine authority involves a relationship between the different parties, and authority comes alive.
Yeah.
Under those circumstances.
Yeah, but also what's very difficult nowadays is that parents, at the one hand, want children to score high and to do well at school, so they need an expert that is able to transfer the knowledge, and at the same time, you're not. It's very difficult when you are tough or strict, or when you enforce. For instance, when you give them extra work. Parents are very active in going to the teacher and say, well, what happened now? And this is not possible. And my child is fantastic, etc., etc. So it's sort of a difficult balance.
Yeah, it is. And it's one of the tragedies of education that adult solidarity has broken down. I know that in the UK, there's almost a silent civil war between teachers and parents.
Yeah.
They continually at each other's throats. The parents think that teachers are, don't understand that my little Mary is a genius, and the teachers think that parents are idiots because, so there's a kind of mistrust on both sides, which is very unhelpful. And actually, the only solution to this problem is to keep parents out of schools. But unfortunately, I don't know about Holland, but in England, we invite parents into the school all the time. We tell parents to help children with their homework. When I was a child, the idea of my father helping with my homework was called cheating. You weren't doing your own homework. Your parents were helping. Well, now we invite them to help kids with their homework. So it's not surprising if we invite parents to be amateur teachers, they are going to end up playing this very corrosive role within the education system.
But that's happening. Sorry, Frank, but that's happening a lot in Holland. There's a book written about from a scientist. It's called schaduwonderwijs, so shadow education, and she explores how many parents pay tutors or do extra activities. You can do it via an app. You can buy it, and for instance, people who have money, they will do it, or they will send the child to the best schools, or they will try to enforce the highest possible outcome. It's a very big business also in Holland.
Yeah, I mean, it's same thing same thing here. It's a huge business, and it has a very sort of destructive effect on the education system. It's unfair to people who have no money or are poor. Yeah, it's totally discriminatory in that regard. But also, it undermines one of the most important philosophical elements of education, which should be part of a common curriculum, a common experience. Yeah. When you bring children of all kinds of abilities and backgrounds together, instead of ghettoizing them, or instead of sort of treating them so differentially.
Yeah, well, that's a process that's really happening in Holland, also in the school system itself, with internal guidance processes, reading experts. So there's not only a teacher now, but there's a very big shortage in Holland of teachers because, well, the system didn't invest enough money, I think, also in the last 20 years, and to choose for an occupation like this is not very attractive for a lot of people. But what you see at the same time is that if you want to make a career in the educational system, a school leader is the only way up, or to become an expert. So you see that there's a lot of processes happening, which sort of makes the process of giving a class or being a teacher very difficult.
Yeah, well, we have this problem here as well, where very often a teacher who's really good in the classroom is told, well, why are you doing that? You could be a headmaster, you could be running the school. And unfortunately, far too many people leave behind what they are really good at, and what they do is very, very important, and become, in effect, bureaucrats and administrators, which I think is a real waste of their talent.
Yeah, so then you lack a good teacher and you gain a bad manager.
exactly.
Yeah, or mediocre manager. What? Yeah, yeah. Well, that's very interesting. Frank, I could talk for hours with you. Yeah, but maybe a last question, maybe two last questions. First one is a question from one of the listeners, Casper Hulshoff, who is a educational scientist at the University of Utrecht. He said he read your book Wasted. He said, well, it's in his perspective also a pessimistic approach to education, maybe also realistic in a way. He says at the same time. Now we are 10 years later. Are you positive or more negative about the educational system?
Well, I mean, the way to understand it is that you can be pessimistic about the education system whilst being optimistic about the power of education. And the reason why I wrote Wasted was precisely because I believe that it's possible to change the way we educate the younger generations. You know, I know from personal experience because I got friends who've set up schools. I talked to a lot of really excellent teachers that even in the present circumstances, a good teacher can change the world for young people, can have a tremendous amount of impact. So I remain optimistic. I am extremely negative about the innovations in education. Now, if you take Holland as an example, I remember the beginning, the very first time when I began to come to Holland, I used to be so impressed by your education system. It was so much better, so superior to what we have in the Anglo-American world. And I remember almost year by year, I don't know why Holland does it, begin to import all these idiotic ideas, these pedagogic ideas from the UK and America. I mean, all the bad ideas that you now have in Dutch society, originate from outside.
Yeah.
And I think that about that, I'm very pessimistic. I think Dutch education system needs to acquire a greater sense of cultural independence and a greater sense of cultural integrity and rethink what it's really doing. But it seems to me that if you read Wasted carefully, it's not a counsel of despair. It's a call to action. It's really about getting our act together and changing the world. And in fact, I have a very nice story I always remember. When I was in Amsterdam about 10 or 11 years ago, I was giving a lecture on education. And afterwards, a group of women, I don't know how many women it was, came up to me and says, we agree with you, Frank, and you'd be glad to know we try to do what you're arguing. We call ourselves the subversive teachers. We're teachers, who don't play by the rules. We do what we think is right, rather than what the school system tells us. And I think that if you could have a larger number of these subversive teachers in Holland or in England, I think that we could have some very positive outcomes, even in the present circumstances.
Great, thanks. That's so. That's also a good way, maybe, to summarize our discussion and our exploration on a sort of sociological perspective on education. You can be pessimistic, but there also is a high standard and a positive outcome if we do the things that we know that work. And And so maybe a last question. You are working on a new book. Can you say something about it, or is it a secret?
Well, it's not a secret. The book is really about the relationship, about the tensions and conflicts that have emerged in education over the last century. And the book begins around 1900 and tries to explain that the debates about pedagogy and the debates about socialization are actually the first expression about the kind of conflicts of values that define the culture wars of today, the kind of arguments that we now have about things like, morality, what are the values we should live by, all the things that are become highly politicized around the development of identity politics, multiculturalism versus, having a more homogeneous cultural orientation, the whole debates about inclusion that you kind of mentioned earlier on.
Yeah.
I try to explain that some of these differences and conflicts are very much linked to the way we bring up young people and the different attitudes towards socialization. And in that sense, I call it 100 years of the cultural war, but it's really about socializing young people and the role of education, but also more broadly, the way that culture is used or not used in this kind of process.
Wow. Well, fascinating. I think I will definitely read it, and I know a lot of the listeners also will. Professor Furedi, thanks a lot for your time and taking the time to answer some of my questions and the questions of listeners. Maybe when the book's finished, I will maybe try to persuade you to do a sort of a sequel. How do you say? Sequel.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right.
Thanks.
All the best. Thanks so much for talking to me. Take care.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.